for us, native prairies and grasslands are a big opportunity for carbon storage. But what my intention is, and the reason why I joined this company, is there's a lot of costs associated with doing really good regenerative style grassland management. I know a lot of ranchers that have struggled with the challenge of how are they going to make their operation financially sustainable in the long term if they're trying to make long-term land use decisions that are best. And the reason why I got interested in this marketplace is because it seems like carbon credits may be a good opportunity to finance some of those long-term regenerative decisions. So what I'm going to talk about today is what is a carbon credit market in general, what does it mean for different landowners, and then as just an example, I'll go through kind of what the way that the procedure ends up working for Grassroots Carbon, which is the company that I'm most familiar with. So I'll start with the absolute basics. Most folks are going to be pretty familiar with this, that the temperature on the planet is likely affected by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One of the gases that is certainly most sought after and thought about the most is CO2. CO2 comes from a number of different sources, but especially from the combustion of fossil fuels. And that likely, at the very least, most folks end up thinking that those greenhouse gases end up affecting the long-term climate. So the motivation for a carbon credit industry is how do we start to reduce the total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Now, a lot of folks know about tree storage, that tree trunks hold a lot of carbon dioxide, that there's a lot of different ways to put living biomass to work by storing carbon. What a lot of folks don't know is that there's more carbon in all soil on the planet than there is in the atmosphere or in all plants combined. The only larger carbon sink on the planet is the ocean. And when you look at the total amount of soil carbon, a huge portion of that is in pasture and prairie land. And so for us, it's a really big opportunity because adjusting those numbers means that there's a lot of opportunity to end up storing that carbon, and there's big financial opportunities involved. So because of large amounts of emissions and because there's a lot of different groups that are interested in having companies reduce their total amount of emissions, there's starting to be real serious financial incentives. Now, what are those pressures that are pushing these companies to start to make commitments? Consumers obviously have somewhat of a say. They are interested in reducing their own footprint and buying products that have a smaller footprint. And that's the one that gets a lot of press. My experience has suggested that that is probably somewhat of a motivation for companies, but much less than the other ones that are on the list here. So there are activist investors in a lot of these really large companies, especially publicly traded companies, that are only looking to put their money in places that they think are starting to get closer towards carbon neutrality and environmental sustainability. There is large environmental groups that have some litigation potential and different ways of exerting pressure on those companies. There's also employees that are looking to join companies that they think have better environmental and social standards. And then ultimately, I actually think that governments and likely regulation are a primary motivation for what a lot of these companies are choosing to do. And I'll get into a couple examples pretty shortly. So companies need to reduce their emissions. And one way to do that is by buying carbon credits for the storage of that carbon. And we think that private landowners have a big opportunity because they have a solution, a way for them to store that carbon in the long term. So photosynthesis is the primary way that that carbon is coming from the atmosphere and going into the soil. Grasslands turn out to be a pretty effective way to do that. They use photosynthesis to produce sugars. Sugars are locking up a lot of those carbon molecules, and they store them initially in their plant biomass, and then in that biomass, they actually push them down into the soil themselves. So one way that happens is that the grasses themselves, as they die off and decompose, they provide some of their biomass and have it stay in the soil. But another way that a lot of folks don't talk about very much is that they actually exude those sugars because they think it's useful for the soil ecology that surrounds them. So those are called soil exudates. And the general theory here of what motivation the plants might have in order to do this is if there's a more active soil ecology surrounding the root zone, the rhizosphere, then there's more nutrient uptake possible, and there's a more healthy environment for that plant to grow as years go on. So about 40% of what is stored in terms of photosynthesis is actually pushed out into the soil through these soil exudates. And that's a big way that soil itself starts to store and capture that carbon over time. So pretty simple version here, where a company emits a ton of CO2, puts it in the atmosphere. They end up paying for the sequestration of the same ton, and they can commodify it and then have it purchased and offset through a single unit of a carbon credit. So most of the time, those carbon credits are 1 ton of CO2. And that's the basic metric that's used throughout this industry. So at the moment, that can be sold for a number of different prices, and the financial spend for those companies is actually what ends up propelling more carbon storage through nature-based solutions over time. When a carbon credit buyer is paying for that ton of CO2, they're actually paying for 2 things at once. One of those is the act of taking it out of the atmosphere, but the second thing is storing that carbon for a certain period of time. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but very different companies, different standards, different strategies are going to store that carbon for different periods of time. And as a result, they get to be sold at a different price, because not every carbon credit comes from the same place. And as a result, not every carbon credit is priced the same way. So at the moment in the United States, there's a voluntary market for carbon credits. It means that for the most part, there's no central regulation that decides how the standards are going to be determined, what company or what sort of carbon storage is sufficient. This is different than the European market, which is mandated. And eventually, a lot of folks think that the voluntary market in the United States may transition closer to what the Europeans have. And Canada right now is somewhere in the middle. California is trending on its own kind of in a European direction, but there's a carbon tax potential where there's just a total cap of carbon that can end up being emitted per company. And then there's cap and trade policies that are also possible, in which there's a balance sheet that a company has to be very careful about how many credits they're using and how many credits they're producing. And in the long term, this is likely one of the primary motivations for why these big publicly traded companies are trying to get ahead of the market by figuring out where their carbon credits are going to be sourced from, because in the long term, they're afraid that this regulation may be a pretty large business challenge for them that they have to solve now. So if a company decides that they need to reduce their carbon footprint, there's a lot of different ways for them to do that. Soil carbon, which is relevant for us who are interested in native type prairies, that's obviously a very interesting nature-based solution. Another one is forestry credits. A lot of folks are familiar with reforestation, or oftentimes called afforestation schemes, in which they plant lots and lots of different trees. These are what we refer to as nature-based solutions, so ways to utilize photosynthesis and natural processes in order to store that carbon. But there's alternatives as well. Technology-based solutions, especially what's called direct air capture, is another strategy that a lot of companies are trying out. And in the marketplace, these nature-based and technology-based solutions are competing a lot of the time with different prices and different sources. Other ways, of course, that companies can reduce their total carbon footprint is by just making their own operations quite a bit more efficient. But there are certain types of energy use that are just not going to be able to go away. If there's a certain amount of air travel that's required, for example, or a certain amount of energy production in general that can't necessarily transition quickly towards renewables, these companies are going to have to purchase offsets through carbon credits. And the industry is becoming quite large very, very quickly. So in the United States, the carbon capture industry pretty shortly is going to have to store about 1.5 billion metric tons of CO2 per year. And that means that there's a lot of different opportunities for ways to do that. At the moment, the industry is already 6.6 billion metric tons per year in terms of its size. Soon, there's going to be much, much larger requirements for what those companies want. And as well, they're starting to compete within the voluntary market for how much they would like to store over time. One example is that Shell has announced that they are going to try to use carbon capture technology to the tune of about 25 million metric tons per year by 2035, but to use 120 million metric tons of CO2 on a similar timeline through nature-based solutions. So they're a company that approaches someone like us to try to figure out, okay, we're very interested in leveraging grasslands. How do we connect with landowners and effectively value, measure, and then purchase these credits? So, all right, that's what the demand ends up looking like. What does the supply end up looking like? For someone who's interested in utilizing grasslands, the approach that we generally take are folks that are connected to the livestock industry in some way. And grasslands in general obviously have a lot of carbon storage potential. Some amount of wildlife and livestock, we think, end up providing a pretty useful opportunity in order to integrate with revenue generation on those grasslands at the same time that they're storing carbon. So ultimately, what does it end up looking like is healthy vegetation on a site, hopefully integrating some amount of wildlife, some amount of native plants, and then, if we're having a decent year, some amount of precipitation, ends up generating some plant biomass. That biomass then improves the soil over time and results in a lot of soil ecology, that there's a lot of different microbes that are successfully producing an ecosystem that they can interact with. That ends up storing soil carbon over a good period of time, and it's all driven by that photosynthesis from those grasses. About 90% of soil function is driven by microbes within that soil, and the microbes also depend on the plants that we're hoping that private landowners are going to be able to incentivize and effectively build up. We know that folks like you who are interested in native prairie land are pretty well acquainted with the relationship between really good plant ecology and soil ecology. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to livestock management, there's a lot of different ways to do it. One way that we know over time erodes soil is if you have a single pasture and a lot of cattle where they don't move around. They mow down whatever grass is on that space over a long period of time, and eventually it becomes very difficult for the grasses to recover. On another hand, if there's a larger amount of pastures on a property and cattle are allowed to rotate and they're not vastly overstocked, then there can eventually increase the total amount of plant biomass over time, because most of these environments evolved to have some amount of grazing that takes place, because historic prairie land, historic grasslands had a lot of migratory herd species moving through. Now, there's a lot of different ways that ranching can end up happening towards a regenerative type context where grasslands are responding positively. There's no real one size fits all solution, but generally the way that we approach it is if you can increase the rest periods of pastures, then you're going to end up having more healthy grass ecology, and as a result, more carbon storage over time. So, okay, that's how the supply ends up working. How does the price between supply and demand end up happening? So in the EU, prices have gotten quite high. $64 per ton, not unusual at all. In 2021, that price tripled. In the United States, that price is not close yet. And I can't actually say what the price is in a public context like this. The SEC used that as price setting. But it seems like the trading market is not yet to where the EU is, but it's certainly going up. What we've seen over the last 3 years or so is that the price of a carbon credit continually increases. And as a result, the opportunities grow larger and larger for landowners who are interested in leveraging these nature-based solutions in the carbon credit market. The other thing to note is that not every carbon credit is the same, and as a result, it's not priced the same. These soil carbon credits are priced much higher than forestry credits that are using monoculture type afforestation schemes, where they plant the same tree over and over. They know it grows very rapidly, but it does not mimic a natural ecosystem very well. As a result, biodiversity doesn't respond as well. The total water conservation benefits. What the buyers of carbon credits that we are working with, we have about 6 or 7 very large buyers of our credits. They know that the specific unit of a carbon credit is meaningful in that it draws something out of the atmosphere. But soil carbon credits have added benefits of replicating natural ecosystems, and as a result, also improving things like biodiversity and water conservation at the same time. While we're not quantifying those perfectly, there's knowledge that if you improve the soil, there's a bunch of follow-on environmental benefits that happen at the same time. And as a result, we can price them quite a bit higher. So that's what the carbon credit market looks like for soil carbon. So, okay, so the market works. now what? There's a whole market outside and a bunch of organizations leveraging different standards. How do you as a landowner interact with them? So about the standards, the way that you assess how much carbon is being stored and if it's being stored for long enough is determined by what we call a standard. So the most common carbon credit standard on the planet is Verra. And the reason for that is because the Europeans have settled as pretty much that is the core unit that they end up utilizing. But in the United States, where it's a voluntary market, there's a lot of different ways for that assessment to end up taking place. Different brokers and companies like the one that I work for, we leverage one, two, a couple different standards for the way that we determine how much carbon has been stored and how many credits as a result can be sold. So when you're thinking about different opportunities, what is the standard is going to be pretty relevant. And a big difference between standards are how long is the term, i.e. like how long is the storage that's required. In the industry, we call that permanence. And what are the previous land use requirements for the current land use as well? And what that is called is additionality. And I'll talk about that in a couple minutes as well. So there's a lot of different standards. There's also a lot of different brokers. So Grassroots Carbon is one of those, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. If you're interested in leveraging your property, I would recommend that you kind of poke around a little bit and see what the different offerings are. No company does this the same way right now because there's no central regulation that pushes us towards uniformity. And as a result, how it's tested, what does the contract end up looking like? How much of a price does the landowner end up getting? These are all things that are determined by the individual company. And so you're going to want to figure out exactly what the offering is for each if you're interested in moving forward with them. So landowners kind of rightly have a lot of concerns and skepticism about this pretty new market and how it interacts with their land. A lot of these companies end up seeming a lot like used car salesmen, where they'll overpromise and they'll say, look, we're just going to make you billions of dollars on your land. You do the exact same thing you've always done. And we're gonna grab money from fossil fuel companies and just put it all in your pocket. Mm-hmm. Now there's a real opportunity. We have to be careful about exactly what those challenges are and exactly what the deal is that's being proposed by the buyer themselves and the broker who's in the middle. So these are just a couple of the concerns that we hear fairly often, and I'll try to address them the way that I can. Now, one of the most common things that we hear is, well, it's a fairly new industry. We would like to just sit back and wait and see if the industry proceeds for a while and if it's stable enough, and then we'll get into it. And that's a totally reasonable perspective to take. But one thing that we like to remind folks of is, $100 billion a year is starting to move through the carbon capture industry in general and carbon credits. Now, all of that can go towards direct air capture. All of that can go towards monoculture style reforestation schemes. But we would prefer to see some of it go into the pockets of folks that are doing conservation and regenerative livestock management. If that money is all going to go somewhere, we think that ranchers and grassland land stewards are probably a pretty good place to put some of that money. And if it's all going to be moving around anyway, then our priority is to try to get into the pockets of the folks that we know are doing real good environmental work. Yeah. So for a landowner, what do they need to think about individually in terms of whether or not they should interact with the market? So it's a little bit of a complicated scheme how a carbon credit is actually generated. And I'll try to go through. So our company is what's called an assembler or a broker. So we work with ranchers in order to generate those carbon credits through carbon storage, and then we sell them to a buyer. There's a couple of other organizations that we use at the same time. One of those is the measurement company. For us, the way that we measure is using meter deep core samples. And it has a really high validation efficiency because you're doing a lot of measurements on site, figuring out exactly how much carbon is in the ground now and how much carbon is in the ground later. Other companies, the way that they end up measuring is only using satellite images, for example, or drone footage, or there's a lot of different strategies that people use to try to measure how much carbon is being stored over time. So measurement companies that we utilize, they're actually doing soil samples themselves. But measurement companies from other folks, they can be all sorts of different other techniques. So, okay, once it's measured, then it has to go to a third-party organization that verifies how much carbon is actually being stored. If it was just us saying we're producing a certain amount of credits and then selling them, well, we would have a pretty strong incentive to exaggerate how much carbon is being stored because then we can sell more credits and make more money. a third-party organization that maintains that carbon standard is the piece of the pie, or the piece of the puzzle rather, that maintains what that relationship is in order to verify how many credits are actually being produced. So we suggest that during an application process how much we think is being stored, and someone else with independent scientific perspective agrees or disagrees, and then those credits are distributed. So there's a measurement company, there's us, the assembler, there's a verification organization, and then there's actually a certification entity that holds and distributes the carbon credits. And they have what's called a registry where they can keep track of how many credits are sold and produced, and make sure that no one is selling the same credit twice. So it's a complicated industry. One other thing that we just like to emphasize to folks is this is going to end up being a contractual relationship that ranchers have with their broker. And so what we say is interesting, but it's not what's most important. The contract itself is going to be the thing that the rancher or the land steward needs to use in order to figure out exactly what those things are. We encourage folks to use attorneys. We want language within contracts to be predictable. So ultimately what a broker ends up telling you is interesting, but the contract is really where the rubber meets the road. And that's the critical piece of the puzzle. And so if folks are talking to carbon credit companies, just ask for the contract up front and start that negotiation early. So these are a couple of the questions that we deal with pretty often as a result of reasonable misgivings from a lot of land stewards and ranchers. Things involving what is the freedom that they have on their land, how are the payments distributed and broken down, what's the robustness and the assessment of how soil carbon is determined, and then ultimately what are the risks for the landowner. And I'll get into some of the specifics on each. So in terms of freedom, a lot of brokers and standards require pretty strict versions of what's called additionality. And normally what that means is someone is using their land in a certain context, and the carbon credit has to incentivize them to change that land use. For example, if you maintained a bunch of parking lots and someone paid you carbon credits, you wipe out the parking lots and you plant trees. That is an additional different land use. This is what the Vera protocol uses that Europe relies on. It's also what the Kyoto Protocol back in early George W. Bush time said carbon credit should be based on. Now, respectfully, our company at Grassroots Carbon disagrees. We think if a land steward or a rancher is already doing regenerative style land improvements, we would like them to have access to the market. So the version of additionality that the standards that we use subscribe to are how much carbon is actually stored. And that's the reason why we use those meter deep core samples. So instead of projecting out how much carbon is stored as a result of a land use change, we just take samples year 1, we take samples year 5, and the difference between those is what we base the carbon credits off. Now, we still distribute payments through each year, but that's the version of additionality that we subscribe to. Huh. So that's an important piece of how much freedom a landowner continues to have through one of these carbon credits. So there's a lot of other pieces of it. How long are those commitments, which is called permanence? For us, those are 15-year terms usually, but for other carbon credit companies, they can be 20, 40, or 100 years. So these are really important questions that land stewards end up needing to answer. Another important question is how much do they end up getting paid? So a lot of companies that are out there are trying to sell their carbon at a fixed price, or at least to lock in a fixed price for how much the carbon credit is worth. That sounds okay now, but most folks, us included, think that over time the carbon price is going to increase. And so you want to make sure that you as a landowner continue to be able to get an increasing portion of the increasing price at the same time. For us, that means that 80% of the profit from carbon credit sales go to the land steward. And so if the price goes from $20 to $30, 80% of that difference goes to the land steward. But there are other companies that don't do that. And wow. The breakdown of those things is really important. What is profit? What is cost? These are all really important pieces in order to determine how much the ultimate payout is going to be for the land steward. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we use samples in the ground. Other folks use models. They use satellite images. Other folks do soil samples, but they're much shorter than we do because we use full meter deep samples. So these are important questions about exactly what the carbon storage possibility is on a specific property. So we'll talk about the risks a little bit in a second as well, but the most important things to keep in mind are can this cost me money? Does it restrict my ability to utilize my land the way that I want to? And do I have the ability to switch to a better deal if I find one in the marketplace? And so we think that our company has a pretty good answer to these questions, but those are the ones that you really want to keep in mind when someone approaches you for carbon credit generation on the property. So this is Grassroots itself. I went a little bit over some of these things already, but I'll just dive into them for a second as well. And this is one example of a company in the market and how we approach them. So we are the assembler. I mentioned that earlier. We use two different standards. One of them is a 15-year agreement. That's called the regenerative standard. That doesn't have strict additionality requirements. It means that folks that are already encouraging native prairie land, for example, are still eligible, even though they have already been doing regenerative land management. We also offer Vera protocols for folks that are making land use transitions. Vera is handy because there's obviously quite a large market for Vera type carbon credits because the Europeans mandate. But we have a lot of different contracts that utilize both, or either, rather. So for us, for a carbon storage buyer, we know exactly how much greenhouse gases are stored because of our core samples, and it's independently verified and certified. For landowners, it means that anyone can participate, even if they're already utilizing regenerative practices. They maintain control of their land, and it's a realistic permanence requirement. So it's a 10-year storage term, which means that it's a 15-year term total. These are numbers that we think normal landowners are able to interact with, as opposed to 50 years when they really have no idea what's going to be happening at that time. This is just a visual demonstration. We take a measurement year one, determine exactly what the total amount of soil carbon is, and then year 5, we test and figure out exactly how much increase happened over that time. But instead of waiting 5 years in order to pay folks out, the independent organization that we work with allows us to do what we call forward assessed credits. So every year, a land steward gets paid out based off of what they think is being stored. Then in year 5, we check the math. And because we think our projections are conservative, we think that there's going to be an extra payout in year 5 as a result of additional storage that's taking place. This is a demonstration of how we figure out where the sample sites are. So we stratify the property to figure out how many different soil types are distributed throughout. So for you guys, there's obviously post oak savanna and blackland prairie. There's going to be different amounts of soil carbon in each of those kind of different biome areas. And as a result, we take samples from each to try to get a more accurate aggregate over time. There's a storage requirement I've talked about a little bit as well. So the storage requirement for the first year ends in year 11. The storage requirement for year 14 and for year 4 ends in year 14. And about 10% of the credits that are generated in the front end are held until that storage period is ended to incentivize the maintained carbon storage over time. And what maintaining storage for soil carbon means is you're not tilling the land in order to release all that carbon, and also you're not doing really large land use development. So you're not putting a subdivision on, for example. There's certain things like wind generation or certain fossil fuel extraction that is permitted because it's not going to disrupt the vast majority of the soil on a property. But other types of development are restricted because they do huge amounts of soil degradation. So in our mind, this is fairly easy for ranchers to end up integrating. They do some good land management. We take samples at the beginning, we take samples 5 years in, and we figure out exactly how much was accrued. We pay 80% of the carbon profits minus the measurement and certification cost, which also comes out of our piece. And it's your land, you stay in control. The only specific land management practices that we have are you can't till, you can't do big developments. Then we have some additional practices that we encourage, things like reducing herbicide use, reducing dewormers, and different practices like that we know improve long-term soil ecology. So this is just a really rough example of what some of the payout can look like. So on a 5,000 acre ranch over 5 years, it's very possible to get up to about $1 million worth of revenue over that time. This is a Texas property example, and it presumes a pretty stable and and normal amount of carbon storage that can happen over time through regenerative style land management. One thing we like to brag about is our company was the first to actually pay ranchers for carbon credits. And we are still the company that's paid out the most for ranchers and grassland land stewards over time. So the way that a rancher interacts with a company like us, we start talking, we start to come up with estimates for how much carbon storage is going to happen over time. You review our contracts, you ask the questions that you're interested in. If we sign the contract, then we schedule those soil carbon measurements. We give you access to a piece of software I'll describe in a second called Pasture Map. And then ultimately you just try to keep your soil healthy, do as much as you can to store that carbon, because you know in year 5, you're going to get a better payout if you end up doing really effective land management. Pasture Map is a piece of software that we own. About 25,000 ranchers have signed up for it. It manages millions and millions of acres. It allows ranchers to be able to do rotational grazing a little bit more efficiently by tracking where their different pastures are to move them from place to place. For us, this is useful as well because instead of having to do any reporting requirements or anything for what the rest periods are for a property, a convenient asset for ranchers is able to just automatically upload some of that information. And lots of ranchers utilize this tool already, unrelated to carbon. Most folks just think that it makes their record keeping a lot easier for their long-term land management. So went through how it works. What does it pay? What do they have to do? So ultimately, what are the risks? For us, there's no out-of-pocket costs for the soil measurements or the application fees. There's also no way for the landowner to lose money as a result of weather conditions. The question we get most often is, if soil carbon doesn't accrue fast enough because of drought conditions, what happens to the money that we've already been paid out year 1 through 4? Well, for us, that's a gamble that we're taking. It's the reason why we end up getting a portion of the sale. So we are betting that your carbon is going to store over time. If we're wrong, then we have to make up those carbon credits in a different property. If we're right, then the rancher gets extra revenue as a result of year 5. But the year 1 through 4 payments that are distributed annually, those don't have to be returned to Grassroots Carbon, except for if large-scale tilling happens, if land is sold without the new landowner signing on to the same agreement, or if you build a bunch of houses on top function. Or, of course, if you want to sell to a different broker instead of us, then that contract is going to have to buy out the one that we've already signed. But if it's weather, if it's forces beyond the control of a rancher, then there's no real way for them to lose money on a carbon credit deal. So those are the risks. For us, we try to make things easy, transparent, and make sure that you maintain your freedom. This is one of the first ranchers that we worked with, Lois Neary. These are just a couple quotes from him about the reason why he ended up choosing a company like ours. He is leveraging adaptive high stock density as his land management technique. That is not required. What we're generally trying to encourage is more rotational style grazing management. And so if you are interested, then if you go onto our website, you can submit a pretty quick form that is going to allow us to get in touch with you. We'll start to request things like a map of your property. That allows us to assess a proper revenue estimate so that we can tell you how much money you're likely to make from a carbon contract. And so I would encourage folks to reach out to us if you're curious, and also just to research the carbon market more generally, including other brokers and other standards. So that's what I got for you now. And